Welcome into the studio today where I'm giving a demonstration on reflections. I'll be doing a painting of a simple little scene, kind of a lake with some trees that are being reflected into the water. And I'm going to demonstrate it, but also give you some of the general rules and tips to help your reflections become more effective in your artwork. For this demonstration, I'm using a piece of Fisher 400 paper. I've been using this, actually this is just my second time using it. And I love it. It's very similar to UArt sanded paper. It's a sanded surface and it doesn't curl, however. I'm so excited. Look how flat this is. So I'm probably going to be buying this paper quite a bit. I've gotten some good feedback from you guys in my last video on this. So Fisher 400 paper is awesome. Also, I will be using the Basic Values Maggie Price set of 60 pastels. So this is the set that I'll be working with. It has lots of great colors, lots of autumn colors. So I might give these trees some fall foliage. All right. I'm speeding this up and doing a voiceover because the painting was about an hour, a little over an hour long. And I'm using here a new pastel, a harder pastel. I believe it's the 305 color. 305, yes. It's a dark new pastel and it's really great for doing an underpainting with a dark value, because harder pastels are usually better than, because soft pastels fill up the tooth so much. Even if you're working on an unsanded surface, the rules are still the same. So I'm getting in just the basic dark values. Now what I'm doing here is I use the thought process, as above so below, with regards to the shoreline. Now I'm going to be talking and giving you some more information on how reflections behave while I paint here. But for the most part, you'll see me in a minute turn the painting on its side. And if you have a hard time with this, it's basically a mirror image. Here's what I'm showing here. So whatever you see above the shoreline is typically, now I say typically in quotes because sometimes it's not that way. So right here you can see that I'm trying to get the same basic shapes, think of them as shapes, on either side of the shoreline basically. And I'm going to do a little trick with my blending with alcohol. Now if you are using a water-friendly surface, you can do the same thing with alcohol, or you could use water. And I like to use just an old brush usually. You don't even have to have a nice brush. And I actually would have preferred to use a bigger brush. Now I'm just kind of getting in the general shoreline, kind of a dark bank of a shoreline. I'm getting a little more color in for the land, but it's not going to be as dark as the trees. It's actually a little darker than I planned, but that's okay. And now and I'm going to tell you what you can do if you're not using water-friendly paper in a minute. Now I'm just getting in a little bit of value for the sky and the big parts of the water by kind of just grabbing a little bit of the color with my brush. So I'm pretty much just getting a value study here, but you'll see what I'm going to do in a minute too. I needed more darks, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. Why did I put more dark in the foreground part of the water? I'll tell you that in a little while. Now I grabbed a bigger brush because I realized the other brush was a little too small. Use the biggest brush you can especially when you're just blocking things in, because it keeps a more impressionistic style. Okay, now here's the trick. I am embracing the drips. I don't want my brush so full of alcohol or water that it just pours like crazy, but it's okay if it drips a little bit and runs, because that's what reflections have, that look. They look like they're going very vertically. Now I'm basically just going to reinforce my darks. I'm checking to see if it's dry, and it is. It dries pretty quickly with alcohol actually. And in the Maggie Price set of Terry Ludwig's, they actually do have the darkest dark in the set is the V100, which is the Terry Ludwig eggplant color V100 that so many artists talk about and love. There's some other darks in there that are good, but it's really the best one in the set to establish your darkest darks. And there it is. Look at that gorgeous color. Oh my goodness. Now, there's so many questions for another video. Why would I use this rather than black? And the short answer is it's a much more interesting color. Black is flat and dull and void of color, you know. So anyway, this is much more lively. So I'm just kind of going over now my darkest darks, and I know that I'm going to be layering other colors on top of that. You guys know, my patrons, you know that's kind of the common method for pastels. And now what I'm doing again is the same thing. I am recreating below the shoreline or that bank what's above it. And I'll talk later a little bit about it's not an exact mirror image, okay? Some artists say, or you might hear, just do a mirror image, and there are some scientific principles behind this. Now I'm just adding another color. It's kind of it's a more neutral purple, just to give it a little bit more interest. So now I want to get, you know, I like to push trees back sometimes, and you know we can do that with value changes, a little lighter in value, and a little cooler in color temperature, and usually a little more neutral in color makes things look like they're far away. And I know you guys have probably seen my 5 ways to create more depth in your artwork. That was a really popular video, by the way. Now I'm using a really bold blue here. I want to give an idea of more trees or mountains or something behind there. Cooler temperatures mean what? It's further away. And I'm going to carve these out and neutralize them a little later, but you can go a little bolder at first and neutralize it later. So now I've got some greens and kind of a dull green that I'm just getting in some of the darkest trees. I wanted to be careful too not to have my trees too much like soldiers, equally distanced apart, so I do change some of that later. All right, so now I'm just getting in some basic values. I got a kind of a medium lighter, kind of a lighter blue, and see how I already changed the shape of those trees / mountains in the distance. And once again, same thing as with the trees. As above, so below. You want your sky colors to reflect in the water, whatever it is. Now, I'm using a really neat kind of a cool minty bluish green, and it's a little darker in value than the first one I used. So what do? I pull it down into the water. Now I typically, when I do strokes in the water, I pull them down vertically. Notice those strokes in the foreground water there? You don't have to do that in the sky, you know, the actual sky. Okay, now I'm cooling off the tree / mountains in the back. And I keep saying tree / mountains because it doesn't matter. It's whatever somebody's brain wants to figure out. Okay, now why am I doing darker in the water here? Okay, we can't see what's in the sky above, right? However, we know that the rules of things in the atmosphere or the heavens, the sky, they get darker as they get higher. Well, we can't see the top part of the sky. Oh, I'm showing some neutral colors. I'm neutralizing still and cooling off those mountains. But because we can't see the upper part of the sky, you know, my horizon line's in an upper third, I know that because my lower part in the water shows more sky, it's going to be as above, so below. I'm going to darken the actual heavens part of the sky. I hope I'm making sense here. Even though you can't see it in the top part of the painting. So you're basically using the rules of how things work. Well, it kind of works that way in the photo. You can see over there to the left-hand side of my hand. Now, it had some clouds. I didn't focus so much on the clouds and the breaks in the clouds and the water, but you can see definitely in the photo that in the foreground part, it's darker. So that's why I'm, you know, going ahead and getting darker in the water part of the foreground. And it works. It's the way, it's physics. It's the way things work in nature. So I'm still neutralizing here. I just grabbed some neat neutrals. Now these neutrals that I grabbed were not in the Maggie Price set. And now I've got to make some decisions here. I've got to work on the grasses or the bank and that land part. And I'm going to use the typical strategy of getting some complementary, like a complementary color underpainting. What were the colors in the photo? Mostly greens. So I'm adding some orangey, salmony kind of colors to the bank, and then I'll add greens on top. But what do? If I see it above, I'm going to recreate it below. Now, here's something I want to mention. I'm going to slow it down a bit. Okay, now even though I'm painting in different areas, I'm going to try to get you to hopefully understand what I'm talking about here. The salmony color that I just did on the bank. Now, if I was doing the typical mirroring effect that I mentioned before, I would have more of that lighter peachy salmony color kind of in the area where I'm painting right now. Well, why don't I? I mean, if it was a true mirror effect, if I turned it sideways, I'd have those lighter peachy colors down in the water. The reason is because it's not really an exact mirror with reflections, even when you're looking straight on in this type of angle. It is mathematical and logical. That's the way I'll put it. Now I'm adding some greens, but the same thing will apply. I won't add these greens down in the water. Basically, it is the things that are taller that will show down in the water. Things that are flat, if they're far away, they're not going to reflect down because they're just not tall enough to show in the water. And I've been looking for videos and some really neat way to explain. I actually typed in how far away does an object have to be to show a reflection in the water, and I couldn't find any good information other than some really mathematical equations. And I know, hey, we're doing art here, right? So the basic greatest way to do this is to paint what you see, not what you think you see. And if we're using a reference photo, or if we're painting from life, we can see it. We can see that the grasses on the bank further away are not being reflected in the water. But I like to know how and why things work the way they do. So I'm going to try to create a video that actually explains it more in a more simplified term than some of these mathematical formulas, so we can know. What if you want to paint from imagination? What if you want to add something somewhere? It would be neat to know how to do that. So, all right, I'm rambling here, I know, but there are rules to make this more effective, and it's not always the mirror rule. So hopefully I made some sense of that. And now I'm adding some greens. And think of it this way. Close to the shoreline, that bank, if you have some tall grasses kind of growing up by there, they will get reflected into the water. But the grasses that recede further into the distance, because they're flat, they're not going to reflect into the water. Only the vertical things reflect. That might be a good way to think of it, you know. And now I'm adding, again, like some of those grasses that are a little taller, they're going to reflect into the water a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to speed it up a little bit more and give you some other general reflection painting rules. Now, while I paint here, I'm doing the general painting thing here. So, you know, just kind of adding lighter values. I want to add some magentas in those trees. Once again, as above, so below. I actually think that's like an expression that has to do with some kind of occult type of stuff. So I always hesitate saying that, but it works in art. Okay, so that's all I mean by that. But while I'm doing the general painting, I'm going to read to you some reflection rules, and I'm going to type this up too in the post for this Patreon post. I'm reading now from a blog post from artist Lori McNee, and I've actually found she's got some really great blog articles that are very educational. And so this is something that she has on the blog post. I'll include the link in the Patreon post that I share as well, on reflections in general. Now, I talked about this a little bit in one of the critiques that I did a couple of weeks ago. This is a great basic rule. Lights are typically darker when reflected on the water. The sky reflected on the surface of the water is generally a deeper version of the sky above. So if your sky is really light above, in the water, it's going to be reflected just a little bit darker. You know, we talk about this a lot. We just did it with sky holes and everything too, that sometimes things are just a tad darker. And so it's the same thing with the sky. The actual sky is going to be a little darker in the water. Now also, reflections of objects will be somewhat darker and dimmer than objects seen directly. We had this in the Critique My Painting. It was a boat painting. And the boat was actually very light in some areas and dark in other areas, and this principle worked exactly that way. The lightest lights, the white on the boat, was a little darker in the water reflection. And now let's read about the next thing. It's vice versa with darks. Darks are lighter when reflected on the water. Now, I know in my painting here, they are really close to the same value and color because I'm just literally creating the same colors and values in the water. However, you'll see later when I do my technique, my little trick, and you guys, a lot of you probably already know this, when I do a little blending thing, it is going to lighten and neutralize the water reflection from the trees and things in there. So you'll see me do that in a minute. So, but back to the point. Darks are lighter when reflected on the water, and this is due to the object blocking the reflection of the sky. So, like I said, there's some science and some physics involved in it, but sometimes it doesn't even matter if you know all the science behind it. Just that's the basic rule. Light things above the surface are going to be darker in the water, just a tad. Dark things above the surface are going to be lighter in the water. So if you can remember that, that's just such a great general rule when doing reflections. Now I am going to just jump ahead just a little bit here and show you the little blending technique where I'm actually going to be using a piece of pipe foam insulation to do this. You can use the side of your hand, but we're really just going to be pulling what we've created in the water. Like I said, it's almost the same values and colors. We're going to be pulling it down, in my case, with a piece of pipe foam insulation and creating that illusion of reflections. All right, at this point, I've got basically what I want in, and we've got a couple of options here. I can either use my hand or a piece of pipe foam insulation to pull the reflections down. And what that's going to do, it's going to blur them out a little bit. It's going to take them in the direction that reflections usually go. And it's probably going to neutralize the colors a little bit because that's also something that happens. So let's just go, I'm going to do it with pipe foam insulation here. Also going to clean it off with a paper towel. All right, that's already given them the hazy kind of feeling of reflections. I got a little bit of my blue from down here and here. So that's why I started wiping it off. All right, so there's the general idea. Once we have our reflection illusion going, I am basically going in and in an upside down format using pretty much the same strategy as one of the few videos I did, or one of my more recent videos on sky holes. Okay, so, but notice I'm keeping my pastel in a vertical format because that's kind of how the reflections work. They all run very vertically. So I keep my pastels very vertical and I just start carving in a bit of the sky holes with the same principles with sky holes. You want to go a little darker when it's closer into the tree. And now I'm doing exactly what I mentioned before. Water in the foreground is going to be a little bit darker. Now in my reference photo, like I said, I had some purple clouds and things like that. I wasn't necessarily going by the reference photo with that. I was just more using it for color, not really for exact shapes. So I added some purples and some blues, running them now horizontally because water is flat. Now I used my hand to kind of blend it a little bit and just soften it up. Now I'm going to be using another little strategy to gently glaze. Now this is what you want to do with a really light touch. I am using a pastel to just gently glaze over the surface of those reflections. Now, of course, you'll use a lighter value pastel and something that's kind of harmonious with what you've already used. So I have used that lighter, medium to light blue in the sky. So I just gently, you got to use such a light touch with this, glazed over the water, and it gives that feeling of breaking water. This water in this scene was a kind of a still water scene, but still you get a little bit of that on top of the water. So it really flattens out that water and gives it that illusion of water on top of the reflections. Now I have two other little things I'm going to do to kind of continue with that illusion of water and the bank. I'm adding a little bit of a dark shoreline to the bank there. And now the last thing I'll do, adding just, you know where the water just kind of meets the shore? Sometimes there's a little break in the water, and I'm just knocking it off a little bit with my finger so it's not so stark, but just a teeny little break in the water. You don't want it everywhere, just in a few places, and it really does give that illusion of water. And so I hope this has been helpful in learning a few strategies of how to approach reflections, and I still did paint and have a little fun with this. I added some of the blues and the distant tree line there, and so give it a try. Of course, share it in our homework album if you do try this exercise. Also, I'll be providing some reference photos with reflections within this post. So you will have some tips in this post, some reference images, and also a link to the blog post that I mentioned that had a lot of good information. So here's the final painting. I hope you guys like that. I hope you have a great weekend. I'm sorry for the late upload with this. I had a lot of paintings to ship out today, which was a good thing, right? All right, guys, happy painting.